All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming in to hear what we've got going on in our 4R research fund area. Anybody who didn't join us this morning, the Fertilizer Institute, the Fertilizer Institute is fertilizers industry trade group. So we represent our members in the whole spectrum of fertilizer from production to in-field consultation and management. We have about 130 members. We're based in Washington, D.C. And some of the concerns, same concerns as we had this morning, we were talking about policy stuff, are how do our 4R practices as we implement them in the field impact or influence water quality? How can we help contribute to improving water quality? Contribute to sustainability initiatives? How do these practices help consumer-facing companies reach their goals? How do we help document the reductions associated with 4R practices? Improving nutrient use efficiency so that we decrease nutrient loss and increase profitability of farms. And then other initiatives like Climate Smart Ag, where they want to talk more about greenhouse gas emissions. How does soil health work, and how do soil health and 4Rs work together? And then how do these all contribute to water pollution, air quality, regulation, nutrient loss overall, and how do we communicate to the greater public about, through mechanisms where we've got to use 250, well, it's more than 250 characters on Twitter, but a limited amount of space to talk about very technical management practices and nutrient loss reduction strategies to consumers that only want to read 250 words or characters or whatever the limit is on something like Twitter. So in 2012, the Fertilizer Institute established the 4R Research Fund. This is money that is contributed by our members above and beyond their membership fees to fund research around 4R nutrient stewardship practices and their influence on profitability, nutrient loss, soil health, crop production, and yield. So in the first 5 years of the fund, we got in a little over, why does this not work on the second time every time? A little over $5 million. It's not, I don't know. Every time I go to use it the second time, it doesn't point. I don't know. Anyways, a little over 5 million, about 5.5 million. I don't know what you guys do here in Maryland. To the fund, we funded 12 projects in the US and 10 in Canada, and we were able to double that money so we share the research fund with Fertilizers Canada, which is the Canadian equivalent of the Fertilizer Institute. So in the US, we spent about $3.38 million out of the research fund, but we were able to match that with another $3.3 million of either federal, state, or other private funding dollars. So we were able to double our money in that first year and spend almost $11 million on nutrient management research across the US and Canada. Our members, after lots of legwork and demonstration of what the value of this research is to them and their customers, agreed to commit last year to another 5 years of funding at that same $5.5, almost $6 million over 5-year level. We're just completing our request for pre-proposals. One of the differences between the funding from the first 5 years and the funding from the next 5 years is our board did ask that we get outside our comfort zone a little bit and fund some non-corn, soybean, upper Midwest research. So this current request for proposals, we're looking for tree crops, we're looking for veg crops, we're looking for some irrigated, non-irrigated type situations to start to look at these practices across the broader landscape of crop production in the US. So at the end of the day, we're going to have about $13 million that was contributed from 84 countries. Currently, we funded 25 projects. These are the locations of our current projects. Our initial projects were 5 meta-analysis. So the first thing we wanted to know was what don't we know about 4R nutrient management and what are the gaps we need to fill with these dollars that we have available. Our current practices, our current projects look at those, trying to fill those gaps for our practice impacts on nitrogen and phosphorus loss via water and air pathways. And I'll get into the details of all those projects in the upcoming slides. So first of all, with the meta-analysis, it's important to understand what a meta-analysis is. A meta-analysis searches both the publicly available literature and, if available, any gray literature or published literature on the performance of a different practice or product or a combination of practices, and then tries to take them, as is shown in this graph where we've got fertilizer rate and corn grain yield, what is the sort of common response to this? And the common response we're seeing as we combine these is that as we increase rate, we increase yield. But on all these curves, there is a point where that levels out. Some of them haven't quite reached that point, but there is a point where it levels out. So we can say, in general, as we increase our nitrogen fertilizer application, we should see an increase in corn grain yield. But then we have to get into, at each site, what are the specifics of why and how that works. So our 5 meta-analysis projects, we're looking at, for our nutrient stewardship, on drained land, enhanced efficiency fertilizers in corn Midwest systems, nitrogen loss in U.S. corn-based systems, phosphorus fertilizer placement and tillage interactions, the effects of conservation practices working together, or how do other conservation practices work with our nitrogen and phosphorus management practices, and then looking at we commonly discuss that we've got new genetics, we've got new hybrids. These corn hybrids use nitrogen differently than they did in the past. So we also funded looking at new genetics versus old genetics and how and when nitrogen is being taken up by corn. Looking at the drained land project, this used a currently available water quality database called Manage. It's available for anybody to go online. If you Google Manage, you can go on and search all the data they have in there. They also have some forestry data available in this database as well. And they add any new research that's done on some of the cooperating sites as results become available. So the goals were to determine if the rate of nitrogen, how rate of nitrogen phosphorus application is influences loss and drainage. When we use regular fertilizers versus those treated with inhibitors, how does that change that? Fertilizer phosphorus versus manure phosphorus, timing of application. And they found when they tried to look at placement, there wasn't enough data, and this will be a common theme throughout these 5 studies. There wasn't enough data to say anything about placement. Part of that may be there are not enough studies that look at different comparisons of fertilizer placement. Part of it may be placement of the fertilizer was just not even reported in the research. These are the areas where the majority of the data came from. These are the site years for subsurface drainage, so a lot more diversity. These were the site years where there was good surface drainage data that was available. What they found was that, as we saw in that first slide, unfortunately also as we increase our nitrogen rates, we are increasing yield, fortunately, but we're also increasing our potential for loss to drainage. So we've got to find that spot where we balance nitrogen loss and yield. There was using organic nitrogen, so manure sources of nitrogen or phosphorus, they found could boost corn yields, but there was potentially no increase in dissolved nutrient loads compared to inorganic fertilizer. So basically, there could be some other soil benefits of using those, but once that nutrient gets into the soil solution, whether it's from a fertilizer or from a manure, the loss pathway is the same. Timing did not change nitrogen losses, but it was location dependent. So as we saw in that first graph, there's all kinds of different stuff going on that nitrogen response curve, and those are probably largely influenced by location and the weather occurring at those different places. They did see there was no significant difference in nitrogen application methods, but the caveat here is they only in order to analyze the data, they had to look at one nitrogen application per year. So they were able to look at sort of stacked nitrogen application. 71% of the sites that they had in the studies injected nitrogen, 15% incorporated, and 12% surface applied. So this is one of those places where we can't really say anything about placement because we got 71% of the surface applied because we just don't have enough data in those other practices to draw any conclusions on. And overall, across the literature they reviewed here, less than 2% of the phosphorus that is applied was lost to drainage in any one site year. So phosphorus, we're working with some really narrow margins on what gets lost versus what we apply as we look at, especially as locations look at rate as the answer to changing phosphorus loss. Looking at enhanced efficiency fertilizers, so these are going to be our nitrification and urease inhibitor products. They wanted to look at rates of application of untreated versus treated nitrogen, comparing treated versus untreated nitrogen as a source. How does timing affect nitrogen use on standard versus treated nitrogens? And what is the placement influence when we use these? And overall, does using an EEF produce more corn yield, even regardless of placement, application timing, or rate? So what they found in this study, unfortunately they haven't published this one, this is just the report we got, is that source and timing have the biggest effect on nitrate loss. These are all anhydrous ammonia. We were working again with universities in the Midwest, so a lot more anhydrous still being used out there. But when we apply in the fall application with no inhibitor, we have our highest risk of loss for nitrate to subsurface drainage. Spring application with no inhibitor decreases that. And then when we get all the way down here to spring application with an inhibitor, we see our lowest potential risk for nitrate loss to tile drainage. So the more and more for our practices that we kind of put together here, the more decrease in loss we see. So again, and they found that, as in the last study, nitrogen rate has a greater effect on yield, well, not the same, has an effect on yield, but that the rate has a bigger effect on yield than the use of an EEF. Yes?
Well, one potential problem I see if you stack it all in the spring, the physical movement of the volume of product, somebody say 10 billion tons, if you want to try to cram it in a month period, is there enough storage, is there enough barges, rails that actually physically move this product, apply this amount? That could be a major logistics nightmare, and I don't think there's enough storage
Right.
to accommodate.
It is. It's a challenge, and it's one of the reasons. Some of the other research that's going on in Illinois is looking at, what are the differences in nitrate loss if we do that fall application with an inhibitor versus doing spring application with an inhibitor. What is the scale of difference there? Because that is a huge challenge. And then, what is the difference in how much nitrogen fertilizer we need to produce? Recognizing that anhydrous ammonia is 82% nitrogen, but our urea or our UAN is half that. And so we not only have, like you say, the logistics of making it all happen at the same time, but we have twice as much product that we need to get the same nitrogen fertilizer application rate. South Dakota, I think it was, is almost like a perfect example of that. They had the late spring, and all of a sudden everybody wanted fertilizer in the same 2 weeks, and they didn't have enough trucks to make it happen. So there are some real things that need to be figured out before we make that step.
That affects all of back over here. Once that
Right.
starts, it affects our price per lot.
Right. So yes, good point. So anyways, using our rate affects our yield more than using an enhanced efficiency product. Using an EEF did reduce nitrous oxide losses for all products that were looked at. Timing had a greater effect on yield, and then using an EEF on top of that. They did have a little better availability of placement type information, and they found that banding and split applications can increase nitrous oxide emissions, but not enough information was available across studies. So there's so much influence of environment, which I'll get to in one of the next meta-analysis, that we really have to be careful how much weight we put on just the practice change and not trying to also at the same time figure out how do we use better real-time weather data. Nitrate leaching, they found, had the greatest lack of published data. And again, some of this research published on nitrogen management doesn't even have weather data to go along with it, which makes it really hard to interpret what's happening out there. So looking at overall for our nutrient management in corn-based systems, they wanted to look more broadly at source rate, time and placement, crop yield, nitrate leaching, nitrous oxide loss as emissions from nitrogen rates. And so, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we want to find this point where we balance our our high yield and lower rate in every situation, and that's going to be hard. That weather influence makes that difficult, but we want to try and find that sweet spot off to optimize our use efficiency. So rate, we all know rate's going to influence our yield, but it also had the strongest relationship to nitrate leaching and N2O loss. But it's highly variable. So for each 8.9 pound increase in nitrogen application, there was anywhere from a 2.9 to an 11.9% increase in nitrous oxide loss. So it's a really variable. We can't quite say if you change nitrogen rate, you're going to see X percentage difference in nitrous oxide loss, because there's a lot of variability in it still. On the source side, this is what they found for ranking for nitrous oxide losses. We're the highest with an untreated anhydrous ammonia, and we're lowest when you use a super U-type product where you've got both a nitrification and a urease inhibitor on that nitrogen. Side dressing nitrogen reduced nitrous oxide loss from 30 to 39%, so we're spreading that out over time. We're getting it out there when it's most optimal for uptake. Broadcast placement increased loss by 25 to 33%. This is the big one here, though. Nitrous oxide emissions are higher with warmer temperatures. For a 1.8 degree Fahrenheit degree increase in average July temperature, that's the equivalent to 89 pound different application of nitrogen. So if we're not using weather data to adjust our in-season nitrogen applications, it's going to be really hard to see some of the loss reductions that we want to see, because 1.8 degree average temperature change one way or the other in July is not uncommon. Looking at phosphorus fertilizer placement and tillage for corn, again, we wanted to look at impacts on rate on crop yield, phosphorus loss. Phosphorus was a lot more in these meta-analysis. There was really very little information in most of this research on source or variability in the source of phosphorus used to make many conclusions about phosphorus source. Timing, again, they found there wasn't enough data to look at timing. Placement, wanting to look at crop yield and phosphorus losses as we look at phosphorus management in different tillage systems. So what they found is that when phosphate applications are above a 40 pound per acre band placement, they're going to increase yields when soil tests are lower. So getting that phosphorus closer to the seed as it's getting ready to come up is advantageous. Again, source and time, they didn't have enough information. Placement in their no-till fields, they found that yield was lower with their band placement of P2O5. And placement of fertilizer did not change phosphorus losses when applications were below 40 pounds per acre of P2O5. So there's still some exploration to be done in placement as well. This one looks at that combination of conservation practices and nitrogen and phosphorus losses from fields. They looked at rate of phosphorus with and without conservation practices, Again, source and timing, they didn't have enough information. Placement, the effects of fertilizer application on the loss. And overall, what are the effects of implementing conservation practices on the loss of N&P from these fields? What they found, number one, was there wasn't enough information on any single conservation practice to say that this practice or that practice was going to be most effective in reducing phosphorus loss, that there's so many conservation practices tested in these studies. They just had to go with, is there a conservation practice implemented or was there not a conservation practice implemented? But what they saw was when you apply, when you don't have a conservation practice and you increase phosphorus fertilizer application rate, you increase your potential for phosphorus loss loading. When you apply a conservation practice, you can either level that out, or in some cases, they found a reversal in phosphorus loss because you added a conservation practice to that management. And so then our last one was, yeah, so this is the same one, sorry. Increased effectiveness of conservation practices to reduce phosphorus loss with our increased phosphorus, with higher phosphorus application rates. So if we're in a situation where we have a higher phosphorus application rate or probably a higher soil test phosphorus, if we add conservation practices, we can see phosphorus loss reduction. And they found that incorporation of phosphorus in cornfields is an effective way to decrease phosphorus loss. Now the challenge here is how do we handle or how do we manage phosphorus incorporation in systems that are low or no-till systems, so we get that advantage of incorporation, but we don't undo the positive effects of no-till or reduced tillage. Finally, our last meta-analysis was looking at the comparison of old versus new corn hybrids. So old is sort of a relative term. New era is anything after 1990. Old is anything before 1990 is what they looked at in the study. And they did this both as a meta-analysis, and then they took it out and did a field study looking at different application rates and different timing on new hybrids. What they found is that new hybrids look to benefit from a later season application. They are still actively taking up nitrogen later and later in the season than some of those older hybrids. As far out as post-silking growth stage. And then the field study looked at how can we make that happen? Is it possible to make that happen? And if we do 2 versus 3 versus 4 nitrogen applications, can we also, how is our nitrogen loss to air and water also changing? And we don't quite have all the research in yet from the in-field study part of this project. So gaps in the research that we found from those meta-analysis. We have a lack of complete data reporting. It was really the sort of our number one finding. Not all forms of nitrogen and phosphorus are reported all the time. So as we implement these practices or as we look at the research behind these practices, just because we see a decrease in nitrate loss to groundwater, have we really seen an increased efficiency in crop use, or have we shifted to a nitrous oxide loss or an ammonia loss instead and really not gained any ground in overall nitrogen use efficiency? So that's a big one. Phosphorus. Lots of time, older studies will have only total phosphorus reported. There won't be particulate versus sediment-bound phosphorus. And as seen in the Western Lake Erie Basin, total phosphorus is not really what we need to worry about. We need to worry about that soluble phosphorus fraction. So if we're not measuring it, we don't know which way we're going. And just because we've decreased total phosphorus, have we really decreased soluble phosphorus? In one of our other projects, we're not sure that's really what's going on. So yield, there were actually studies in these various data sets that don't even report yield. A lot of times if the study is a little more of an environmental loss study, they don't even report the yield of the crop. So we don't know that while even if we've improved our decreased our nutrient losses, has that been because we or we did better in yield? We can't say whether or not the practice is performing well. Site conditions information like soil type, slope, and weather are not there. A lot of studies don't report all of the forms of nutrients applied, so we just don't know enough about some of these older studies to really make solid conclusions on practices across the board. Studies in the past have really just been on rate changes and not necessarily looked at combinations of 4R practices, so it's just looking at if we go from 0 to 300 pounds over a stepwise application rate, what are we seeing for nutrient uptake? And then again, testing of the conservation practice. So there were a number of studies, there was not enough studies per practice to make any conclusions about specific practices, just conservation practices in general. So that led us to our in-field studies that we started funding about 3 years ago. These studies all started. So this is in Ohio in the Western Lake Erie Basin. Kevin King with ARS has taken paired fields on farms and installed surface and tile drainage monitoring and collection systems and is looking at practice implementation. This is Matt Helmer's Iowa State University. They have some plots that are set up with some pretty intensive drainage management observation data. So he's looking at 4R practices mostly around nitrogen here, mostly around phosphorus here. This is the infield study of that later season nitrogen application, and this is surface runoff and different timings of phosphorus, placements of phosphorus, and with or without cover crops at Kansas State. One of the things that we've, I'm not sure we've necessarily required, but encouraged all of these researchers to do is that even if their primary treatment is looking at phosphorus, Nathan is still measuring all constituents in this water. He's measuring soluble phosphorus, he's measuring total phosphorus, particulate phosphorus, nitrates, so that we know how it's influencing all of these things at the same time. Common findings of our practices so far is that nitrogen timing has a larger impact on yield than nitrogen loss. Timing of application when using ENEF impact our air and water losses. Placement of phosphorus fertilizer influences phosphorus loss. Soil test also has a potential to reduce our phosphorus losses. This is a terrible, terrible slide and has way too tiny of type on it. But one of the things we tried to do this year, and in anticipation of trying to figure out either what to fund next or get support for the next round of funding, was come up with all the different findings that we had, which are they applied to, and whether or not you're up or down on. So this table is for nitrogen. And one of the ones I wanted to point out here, that's some of the findings out of that study with Tony Vine at Purdue. There is a negative relationship between nitrogen recovery efficiency and nitrous oxide loss. So the more nitrogen we recover, the less we're losing as nitrous oxide in these systems. These other ones I covered in some of the earlier slides, but we do have in here some of the specifics. The other part is that these are all from parts of articles in the Crops and Soils magazine that we've worked on to get at the details and the references. So our knowledge gaps, again, measuring loss from multiple pathways, comparing suites of 4R practices, measuring losses outside the growing season. A lot of times these studies are only done from application in the spring until crop is harvested in the fall, and we know there's more losses going on throughout the rest of the year, and adding those conservation practices. And then we need for studies outside of our Midwest cropping systems, looking at that managed tile drainage database one. That's a great database, but there's a lot of tile drainage areas that don't have any data in that are in the Northeast. And then we also need to understand our nitrogen losses where we don't have tile drainage. This is for phosphorus. Again, placement, application, and conservation are really kind of our top 3 areas to talk about phosphorus loss or changing or reducing phosphorus loss. And again, we need to know more about the different sources. Maybe it's just there isn't enough difference between our phosphorus fertilizer sources versus organic fertilizer sources. But just knowing what fertilizer source was used is important. Timing. Placement's a big one. We need a little more understanding of placement. How does that work with some of our tillage conservation practices? And again, addressing this particulate versus dissolved. I thought I had a different slide in here, but for example, on that particulate versus dissolved, Nathan is in his third year of collecting data, and what he's seen is with cover crops, he sees a decrease in particulate phosphorus coming off these fields in the fall or at water events, but not a change in total phosphorus. So while this water here looks pretty clear and pretty good where you've got a cover crop installed, you're seeing more soluble phosphorus coming off of those plots. So we've decreased the sediment loss, which is great. We need to do that. And in this morning's sessions, I talked about how turbidity or clarity of the water in the Chesapeake Bay is still a big challenge. So we still need to address these sediment losses. We need to be aware that just because we've reduced sediment loss, we may have shifted the type of phosphorus we're losing. And so if we're losing more dissolved phosphorus in this than we were before, that's going to react faster in these freshwater systems and cause different types or different rates of algal bloom occurrences. So it's really important for us to understand what type of phosphorus we're losing as we implement practices. So as I mentioned, we've got the Crops and Soils articles where I try and take information, published articles from the 4R Research Fund and summarize them and talk about some of these practices and where they're working out. When we went to the Hill and when we went to our members to talk about what are the things that we need continued funding on, these are kind of the two statements we came up with. And as I mentioned this morning, so far we've been successful with the management being a priority in the research title of the article. We were successful as well in getting our members to, another almost $6 million to funding for our research. And our current request for proposals, like I said, we're looking for more specialty crops, irrigated versus non-irrigated, tree crops, nitrogen in the far west, that sort of thing. Again, these are our resources. And I went way too fast this time, Chris. I thought I had a lot more slides on there. I can go back and talk more about some of those individual projects. I thought I had the slides on our infield projects in there. The other infield project we're now funding to get at some of those research questions there was we have 5 sites, including one in Canada, where they've coordinated their treatments, application rates, tests that they're running, samples that they're collecting, so that we can start to look at some of that spatial variability when the same practices and treatments are implemented across a larger landscape than what we see when we funded those first 4 projects, where we're really just looking at very distinct areas in either Ohio or Kansas. In Kevin King's project with the paired fields, he's looking at, and he's got a ton of data that he's published. So what he does is he picks paired fields on a production level farm, installs the surface and the tile drainage monitoring, monitors for about 18 months with the current practices, and then goes in and adds 4R practices to that and looks at the differences in phosphorus or nitrogen loss when you add 4R practices to those standard practices. And he's finding, luckily for us, very similar results as we've found in the past, that it doesn't matter what the source of phosphorus that you put on is, whether it's an animal manure or a fertilizer, phosphorus loss is still phosphorus loss. And that when you incorporate, you don't see more, you see a decrease in surface loss of phosphorus, but you're not seeing an equivalent increase in phosphorus loss in the tile drainage, because you are catching that phosphorus through the soil system as it's moving down through the soil. So while you see a little difference in tile drainage loss, it's not enough to offset the decrease that you're seeing from eliminating that surface application of phosphorus.
Quick question. question. You talked about Nathan's study, the H-flume, the water that was being collected there,
Yep.
lower in sediment-bound phosphorus, but higher in soluble phosphorus with the cover crop.
Yes.
So with the dynamics that are going on there, the cover crop is there, it's keeping the sediment, the erosion in check, but how are we solubilizing more phosphorus on the surface with that cover crop? Is that the
So
fire
some
crop?
of-
Is that the cover crop itself, or?
Some of the thinking there is, do we see more soluble phosphorus because there isn't sediment in the solution to help tie up the phosphorus that was going to be there anyways, is kind of the thinking there, because he's seeing that difference regardless of how he terminates the cover crop. So it's not like it's just in the spring when that cover crop is rapidly breaking down and you would expect more soluble phosphorus. That's not what's driving it.
Right, so there's not a slugger release of
Right.
P from the cover crop
Right.
itself. Interesting. Other questions for Sally?
Following up on that, you know, the simple question is, which is worse? Have half the soil moving off the crop, or a little bit of, a tiny bit of soluble phosphorus? You alluded to this.
Right.
One's more active than the other. Could you explain that a little more?
Sure, I will give that my. So when you look at the phosphorus sensitive areas, the amount, and I can't quote you the numbers for like the Western Lake Erie Basin for what the minimum concentration for soluble phosphorus is when they see a bloom happen. But what they're seeing is that as more and more no-till, and there's some good survey data from Ohio State on this, and there's a paper from Harvey that looks at as the region shifted from tillage to no tillage and surface application of phosphorus, which now that we're measuring it, seeing leads to more soluble phosphorus loss, we started to see an increase in algal blooms in that lake. So we've reduced the sediment load going there, which is great because we don't want to fill in Lake Erie, but we've increased the soluble phosphorus loss because of that no-till. So we're seeing more and bigger blooms than we used to see when we were getting that incorporation, even though we might have been getting more sediment loss. But then the next question is, as we make that shift, the phosphorus that was bound to that sediment is still in the lake. And there are mechanisms in the bacteria that make those harmful algal blooms, or the algae that makes those blooms, to solubilize that phosphorus from the sediment. So how do we ever figure out when we're going to see a change in the size of an algal bloom in some place like the Western Lake Erie Basin is really a struggle, because we could reduce that soluble phosphorus loss, but there's so much loading in there at sediment loss, there's still potential for there to be enough there for. So.
Legacy P that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Even if we shut the spigot off today,
Right.
there's still all of that legacy phosphorus, and then add the soluble P to it.
Right, so I think that's one of our biggest phosphorus questions, is how do we balance that decreased soil loss, because there's so many field benefits and water quality benefits to that with getting the phosphorus under the soil, so we see the reduced soluble phosphorus loss at the same time.
Have they eliminated a requirement that the bacteria get rolling faster to release this phosphorus? See, that goes back to your meta-analysis. Most of those show that we're lacking, or somebody didn't collect the data, or
Right.
lacking all this information. And I guess the reason I'm getting at this, here on the Eastern Shore, a few years ago, some anti-farming group came by and said, we're killing the world by no-tilling because of this issue.
Right.
Data coming out of the Midwest, and, the Eastern Shore is pretty flat. So, but, it's possible. We got
Yeah,
a lot of
it's-
poultry, so.
Right. So that is, how do we, and this is the conundrum we get into with the practice recommendation for this is, and you see it more from the conservation side than I feel from the agronomy side, is they want to pick a practice, and this is the practice that's going to fix everything, not necessarily recognizing you got to take all of it into account and really figure out where it's all going to make the best decision.
Other questions? Anybody? Jimmy?
To switch gears to nitrogen, so the study looking at split application, what's like split, which is now standard in our area, the starter and then the side dress, but now there's interest in doing 2 side dress applications when the corn is 2 and 5 foot or 2 and 4 foot or something, which that time period only ends up being 2 weeks most years. So there's not a whole
Right.
lot of chance, but I mean, 1 in 25 to 30 years when you have leaching rain in that 2-week window. I guess my question is, I'm glad to see somebody's looking at N2O losses, but are they also including in that second application the other greenhouse gas emissions from that application, whether it's making the equipment, burning the fuel, using the equipment, and then the N2O losses? I've seen some work where it doesn't really matter whether the rate was 80 pounds or 150 pounds, you had about the same amount of N2O loss. Well, if you put 80 pounds on twice, do you get that same loss twice, or do you get half the loss twice, which equals the same?
All very good questions. Yes, and that's what we're trying to do. You know, what we really recognized from those meta-analysis was so much of that data wasn't collected. And then you move to the Pacific Northwest and California, and they want to know ammonia emissions. And nobody measures ammonia emissions from nitrogen application most of the time. So now we've got all this great research on great timing and placement, and we can't answer questions with it because you can't really ever do it again. You got to do a whole new project. So Tony does have some results out from that, and if I remember correctly, and don't quote me on it, is what they're seeing is with that late season application, you do see a difference in losses. You don't necessarily always see that follow through with a difference in yield. So is there really a benefit to doing that third nitrogen application if we're not getting a yield response out of it at the end of the day? So I think there still is a lot of work to be done on how many times should we split nitrogen application in corn. When I visit our 4R advocates that work with veg crops or the citrus producers, they're doing 6 or 7 splits on nitrogen, but they're doing that now because they're finding that having nutrients available more continuously through the year helps them combat greening disease in the trees. So, because they found it's really more of a root disease than a fruit disease. So I think I would agree. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And then, you know, the one I keep hearing from groups is, well, if we do one type of practice, it's good. If we do all these practices, you know, it's additive and we're just going to get more and more benefits. I don't think we know that it's always additive. You know, if we go to the one meta-analysis, she had a % reduction for split application. She had a % reduction for an inhibitor. She had a % reduction for timing. She had a % reduction for placement. Well, if you add up all those percentages, you get like 150% reduction. And I don't think that, if we can't look at it that way, we need to actually do the study that does all those things together and measures the difference.
Well, it's part of like what Dave was saying, it's the less of the evils or whatever we actually have here. And I flippantly say this, I don't live on the bay. I really don't care about nitrate, but I do live where if climate change is actually happening, that is affecting me. There's a lot of things that we're doing to save nitrate that we're horribly hurting greenhouse gas emissions by doing it.
Right.
Or we could, so I'm thinking, do I want to stop doing these things that are helping nitrate, which ultimately help the bay, and start doing the practices that are going to help lessen greenhouse gas emissions, which may actually help.
Well, and that's where, you know, you get at some of these studies and they only measured nitrate. So we don't know, just because we decreased nitrate loss, did we really use more nitrogen or did we just shift that loss? On the changes in total carbon emissions, when you go to more applications, one of the things I'm seeing working with our 4R advocates is when they go from an out of season or an early spring injected anhydrous ammonia versus 2 or 3 applications in season with more of like a 100-foot boom high voice sprayer, they're cutting their fuel use almost in half. So even though they're going across the field more times, that highboy sprayer uses 10 gallons per hour less fuel than dragging that anhydrous injection piece of equipment across the field. So at the end of the day, we're still ahead on total diesel fuel use because we're using more efficient equipment.
Jim, you also talk about shifting the problem from a water quality problem to an air quality problem. I mean, it just goes up and then it moves and then it drops back down, right? So it becomes a water quality problem again, doesn't it?
Could.
It depends on what the element is.
Right. I mean,
Yes.
anybody else? Going once? Going twice? All right. Thank you, Sally.